A crumpled $5 bill slid across the table and stopped in front of her like a challenge no one had spoken out loud. But what happened next would shake a billion-dollar empire to its core. The rain was pounding against the windows of the nearly empty diner when Naomi Brooks, a black waitress nearing the end of another brutal double shift, looked down at the man sitting alone in booth 6. He smelled of wet wool and cold nights, his hands shaking as he wrapped them around a chipped coffee mug. To everyone else, he was just another homeless old man who wandered in too late and asked for too little. But something in his eyes made Naomi pause. The diner manager had already tried to throw him out. Naomi stepped in without thinking, offering him soup, bread, and a seat by the heater on her own tab. She didn't know that the man hunched over that bowl was actually Henry Calloway, a reclusive billionaire disguising himself as a beggar, searching for proof that humanity still existed beyond boardrooms and inheritance lawyers. When Henry finished eating, he stood slowly and left a single $5 bill on the table. For Naomi, $5 meant bus fare. It meant part of her rent. It meant medicine for her young daughter. The room seemed to hold its breath as she picked it up and then pressed it gently back into his palm. "I can't take this," she said quietly. "In my space, guests don't pay for kindness." That sentence landed harder than any business loss Henry had ever faced. He had spent a lifetime surrounded by greed, especially from his own children, Marcus and Elena Calloway, who were already circling his fortune like vultures. In that worn-down diner, soaked by rain and stripped of status, Henry found what money had never bought him: dignity, freely given. And in that moment, with only $5 between them, the fate of a billion-dollar empire quietly changed forever. But the real test was only just beginning. By the time Henry Calloway stepped back into the rain, the $5 bill still warm in his palm, something inside him had already cracked. For decades, Henry had ruled from the top of glass towers and private jets, feared in boardrooms and obeyed without question. His empire was worth billions, but his world had grown painfully small. Just 1 week earlier, a doctor with careful eyes and a steady voice had given him the truth. No fortune could negotiate stage for cancer. Months, not years. The clock was no longer theoretical. When Henry told his children, their reactions confirmed what he had long suspected but refused to face. Marcus immediately asked about controlling shares. Elena wanted reassurance that the trusts were protected. Neither asked how much time he had left. Neither asked how he felt. In that moment, Henry understood with terrifying clarity that his legacy would not be carried forward by love, but consumed by greed. That night, sleep never came. Instead, an idea formed, dangerous, simple, and final. If blood could not be trusted, perhaps character could. Henry decided to test the world the way the world tests the powerless. He stripped himself of status, wrapped his body in rags, and stepped into places where his name meant nothing. The results were brutal. Luxury hotels turned him away without eye contact. Fine restaurants escorted him out as if he were contagious. Security guards shoved him into the rain while patrons pretended not to see. In every polished space built by money, humanity vanished the moment dignity couldn't pay for entry. By the 5th rejection, Henry felt something close to despair, not because of how he was treated, but because it was consistent, predictable, cold. Then came the diner. Inside that flickering, grease-stained room, no one knew who he was. And yet Naomi Brooks saw him. She didn't ask what he could offer. She didn't flinch at his smell or his clothes. She didn't perform kindness for applause. She simply acted, quietly, instinctively, at personal cost. As Henry replayed her words, "Guests don't pay for kindness," they echoed louder than any speech he had ever given. Naomi had less than nothing. Yet she gave him dignity without hesitation, not because it benefited her, but because it was right. Standing in the alley where his driver waited in silence, Henry straightened his spine. The test was over. He hadn't found an heir in his bloodline. He had found one in a woman who treated a stranger like a human being when no one was watching. And that realization would soon shake his empire far more violently than his death ever could. The truth Henry Calloway could no longer ignore was this: the people closest to him had never truly been close at all. For years, he had excused it as ambition. He told himself that Marcus and Elena were sharp because the world was sharp, ruthless because success demanded it. He had rewarded their cold efficiency, funded their excesses, silenced their failures with money. In doing so, he had trained them well, just not as human beings. Now, facing the end, the illusion collapsed. When Henry lay awake at night, it wasn't fear of death that haunted him. It was the certainty that everything he built would become fuel for people who had never built anything themselves. His children didn't see a lifetime of work. They saw leverage, control, entitlement. Even in his sickness, they hovered like accountants over a balance sheet, waiting for the final number. Henry realized something bitter and liberating at the same time. Legacy is not inherited, it is earned. Naomi Brooks had earned something his children never had. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his wealth. She didn't even know if he would ever come back. Yet she treated him with a dignity that cost her more than money. It cost her security. She gave while standing on the edge of losing everything herself. That kind of character couldn't be taught in business school or purchased with trust funds. As the city lights blurred past the tinted windows of his car, Henry felt an unfamiliar clarity. For the first time in decades, he wasn't calculating risk. He wasn't protecting assets. He was choosing meaning. He thought of Naomi's tired eyes, her steady voice, the way she spoke about her daughter, not with bitterness, but with quiet hope. He thought of how naturally she took responsibility for a stranger's comfort, not because it was expected, but because it was human. That was the kind of person his empire should belong to, not someone who would exploit it, someone who would protect others with it. Henry knew what would follow: outrage, lawsuits, public humiliation, accusations of insanity. His children would call him cruel. The media would call him reckless. Lawyers would warn him of consequences. But none of that mattered anymore, because in a rain-soaked diner, stripped of power and identity, Henry had finally seen the truth. A fortune left to the wrong hands is a curse. A fortune placed in the right heart is a second chance. And for the first time since his diagnosis, Henry Callaway felt at peace, not because he was dying, but because he finally knew who deserved to live on through what he left behind. Henry Callaway did not make the decision lightly, but once it was made, it settled into him with the weight of truth. Back in his penthouse, surrounded by marble floors and quiet that money had bought but never softened, Henry replayed the night again and again. Naomi Brooks standing under harsh fluorescent lights, exhaustion carved into her posture, the way she spoke of her daughter, not asking for sympathy, not begging for help, just stating facts, and still choosing kindness. She hadn't known she was being watched. That was what mattered most. He summoned his attorney before dawn. The man arrived with legal pads and cautious eyes, already sensing the storm. "Arthur," Henry said, then corrected himself. "Are you certain about this direction?" Henry didn't hesitate. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." They went over the details slowly. Trust structures, blind timelines, safeguards, everything designed to protect Naomi from what would inevitably come next. Because Henry was not naive. He knew his children would not accept this quietly. Marcus would threaten. Elena would manipulate. They would call Naomi a gold digger, accuse her of manipulation, drag her past into headlines and courtrooms. That was why Henry insisted on secrecy. Naomi would not know, not yet. The fortune would be sealed, the beneficiary unnamed until after his death. Let the vultures believe they had won. Let them expose themselves fully. As the pen hovered over the final page, Henry paused, not from doubt, but from reflection. He thought about what Naomi would do if she suddenly had power, not the extravagance she might buy, but the dignity she would restore. He imagined her daughter never again counting inhalers or eviction notices. He imagined employees treated as people, not numbers. He imagined an empire that no longer crushed those beneath it. "That waitress," Henry said quietly, "has more integrity than every boardroom I've ever sat in." The pen touched paper. In that moment, Henry Callaway did something radical. He rejected blood in favor of character. He chose humanity over legacy as it was traditionally defined. And for the first time since his diagnosis, the fear loosened its grip, because death no longer felt like an ending. It felt like a correction. Far across the city, Naomi Brooks wiped down her counter at the diner, unaware that her quiet act of decency had just rewritten the future of an empire. She worried about rent, about her daughter's school, about whether tomorrow's tips would be enough. She had no idea that her kindness, given freely without witnesses, had crossed a line no amount of money ever could. And soon, whether the world was ready or not, that kindness would be tested in ways far greater than a $5 bill. The conflict arrived exactly as Henry Calloway had predicted: swift, vicious, and dressed in silk. Within days of rewriting his will, the tone inside his home changed. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations were suddenly misplaced. Marcus stopped pretending concern altogether, his voice turning sharp and transactional whenever they spoke. Elena oscillated between icy politeness and thinly veiled rage, probing Henry with questions that weren't really questions at all, about doctors, medications, mental clarity. "People are starting to worry about you," she said one afternoon, her smile too tight to be sincere. "Running around the city dressed like a homeless man isn't exactly reassuring to the board." Henry heard the threat beneath the concern. Soon the pressure intensified. Lawyers began using careful language. Advisors suggested reevaluations. A psychiatrist was recommended, then insisted upon. It was framed as care, but Henry recognized it for what it was: an attempt to reclaim control, to undermine his competence before it was too late. They didn't know he had already moved 3 steps ahead. Late one night, as rain traced slow lines down the penthouse windows, Henry sat across from his attorney. The documents spread between them like a battlefield map. "They'll come for her," the attorney said quietly. "If they can't undo the will, they'll discredit the beneficiary." Henry nodded. "That's why the trust is sealed. That's why she won't know yet." He leaned back, coughing hard into a handkerchief, then steadied himself. "My children understand power. They don't understand restraint. They'll reveal themselves." And they did. Private investigators were hired. Dirt was sought where none existed. Whispers began: a waitress, undue influence, manipulation. All of it carefully planted. All of it designed to prepare the ground for war. Meanwhile, Naomi Brooks lived her life unaware of the storm gathering around her name. She wiped counters, counted tips, walked her daughter to school with the same quiet determination as always. She had no idea her kindness was being discussed in legal offices and private dining rooms by people who had never once shown any themselves. Henry watched it all unfold with grim clarity. This was the cost of choosing right over easy. One evening, after Marcus stormed out of a meeting and Elena threatened to take this public, Henry finally spoke the words he had been holding back for years. "You don't deserve what I built," he said calmly. "And you never did." The silence that followed was electric. They left furious. Henry was left alone, but for the first time, not lonely, because even as his strength faded, his resolve did not. He had drawn the line, and no matter how violently the world pushed back, he knew this much was unshakable. Kindness had challenged power, and power was afraid. The moment arrived, not with thunder, but with silence so heavy it pressed against every breath in the room. The reading of the will took place in Henry Calloway's private library, walls lined with books no one in his family had ever read. Sunlight filtered through tall windows like a final witness. Marcus sat rigid, jaw tight. Elena paced, heels clicking in sharp, impatient rhythms. They were not mourning. They were waiting to collect. Henry's attorney cleared his throat and began. At first, the words were harmless formalities, acknowledgments, small personal items. Marcus relaxed, exchanging a quick glance with his sister. This was going exactly as expected. Then everything changed. "To my son Marcus," the attorney read evenly, "I leave my collection of cufflinks, and no controlling interest, no cash assets, and no authority within Sterling Holdings." Marcus laughed once, sharp, disbelieving. "That's not funny." The attorney didn't look up. "To my daughter Elena," he continued, "I leave the portrait of her mother in the hope it may remind her of the compassion she never learned to practice. I leave no equity, no cash assets, and no authority." Elena's face drained of color. "This is insane," she whispered. "He was sick. This can't be legal." The attorney turned the page. "The remainder of my estate, my company, properties, and assets is bequeathed in full to a single beneficiary." Both siblings leaned forward. "Who?" Marcus demanded. The room seemed to contract as the attorney spoke the name: Naomi Brooks. The silence shattered. "A waitress." Elena screamed. You're saying he gave everything to a waitress? Yes, the attorney replied calmly. Effective immediately. Rage exploded. Threats, accusations, vows of lawsuits. But none of it mattered. Henry had anticipated every move, locked every door, sealed every crack. The will was airtight. The truth was unavoidable. Miles away, under flickering diner lights, Naomi Brooks was scraping plates, unaware that her life had just split into a before and an after. She still worried about rent, still counted tips, still planned tomorrow's shift. When the black car finally pulled up outside the diner and a man in a tailored suit asked for her by name, Naomi felt only fear, not excitement, not hope. She had no idea that a $5 bill she never accepted had just returned to her as an empire. And in that moment, when kindness collided with power, the world tilted, reminding everyone watching that sometimes the greatest turning points don't come from ambition or force, but from a quiet choice to treat a stranger like a human being. Naomi Brooks didn't feel rich when she stepped out of the diner that night. She felt terrified. The black car waited quietly at the curb, rain misting the pavement like the world itself was holding its breath. When the lawyer finally explained who Henry Calloway really was and what he had left her, Naomi's knees nearly gave out. An empire, billions, power she had never asked for and never imagined. Her first thought wasn't excitement. It was her daughter, safety, responsibility. Henry's children screamed betrayal. The media screamed scandal. Boardrooms trembled. But Naomi didn't scream at all. She stood still, clutching her daughter's hand, remembering the cold man who had needed soup more than status. She understood then what Henry had seen. Wealth doesn't reveal character. It tests it. And kindness, when given freely, has a way of outliving power. Naomi didn't become what the world expected a billionaire to be. She became what the world rarely sees. Someone who remembers where she came from. She paid debts quietly, protected workers loudly, turned empty buildings into shelters. And every Tuesday night, she and her daughter sat in a modest kitchen, sharing soup, just like before. Henry Calloway had built an empire with money. Naomi Brooks rebuilt it with humanity. This story teaches us something profound. You never know who is watching the way you treat people when there is nothing to gain. True character isn't revealed in moments of reward, but in moments of choice. Kindness given without expectation is never wasted. It travels. It echoes. It changes lives, including your own. Now we want to hear from you. If you were Naomi, what would you have done? Would you have given back the $5 or kept it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story matters. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe to StorySphere, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more powerful human stories like this one. Because sometimes the smallest act of kindness creates the greatest legacy. That also tell and comment from where you watching.